Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar as part of Refuels Week. My name is Dave Keating. I'm a journalist based in Brussels. I'm coming at you live from the heart of the EU quarter to walk you through today's webinar, which is dedicated to liquid fuels in the bioeconomy. Now, this whole series is intended as a larger discussion with many of the issues facing liquid fuels, and we really want your interaction at home. You're going to be able to ask your questions, as you can see there on your screen, to the panelists. Go ahead and type those questions in at any time, and I'm going to pose them to the panelists. So perhaps before we get started, we should talk about what the heck is the bioeconomy. So there's different definitions of it, but the Bioeconomy Council defines the bioeconomy as the knowledge-based production and use of biological resources to provide products, processes, and services in all economic sectors within the frame of a sustainable economic system. The bioeconomy is a shift from fossil fuel-based economy to a bio-based economy. So things that are reusable, things that are naturally grown and can be reused again. It's a new model for industry, transport, and other sectors. It involves using renewable biological resources sustainably to produce food, energy, and industrial goods. It also exploits the untapped potential stored within millions of tons of biological waste and residual materials. We all know the type of energy that is stored innately in fossil fuels that we have used, but a lot of energy can also come from the natural products all around us. So the question we're asking today is, how does the production of liquid fuels integrate into this evolution? Are there any risks of competition for access to the feedstock or the raw materials? Is this the emergence of a more local and regional supply chain? And what impact will all of this have on trade and on the security of supply? Well, to talk about these questions, we have our three panelists with us here today. Let me introduce them now. First off, we have John Cooper, Director General of Fuels Europe. He was appointed Director General of Fuels Europe and Konkawa in April 2015. He started his career in the motor industry, working on future powertrains, and after 3 years, he moved to BP Downstream, where he has 27 years of experience. His previous role was as Director of Renewable Strategy Downstream, leading BP's commercial compliance strategy. Next, we have Alexander Bachler from Copa-Cogeca. So Alexander is chairman of the Working Party on Bioenergy at Copa-Cogeca. He's also a senior expert on energy economics and politics at the Austrian Chamber of Commerce. His key aspects of activity are biofuels and biomethane, sustainability criteria, bioeconomy, apropos for today, and standardization. And finally, we have Marko Janhunen. He's Director for Public Affairs at the Finnish forest industry company UPM. Marko is an expert in public policy issues related to environment and energy, climate change, and transport issues, with 20 years of experience from projects on all continents. Marko is previously the chair and current vice chair of the Advanced Biofuels Coalition, the LSB, which is a coalition of 11 companies from 9 countries promoting advanced biofuels for transport decarbonization. Gentlemen, welcome to all three of you. Thanks so much for joining us today. John, let me start with a question for you. Maybe answering that very first question I posed in the introduction. How will the production of liquid fuels feature in the evolution of the bioeconomy, in your opinion?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dave, for the question. So let me just recap a little. As an industry, we understand absolutely that the objective in Europe for climate neutrality has got very far-reaching implications, in particular for today's users and producers of liquid fuels. And we all know that today liquid fuels are mostly produced from petroleum, around 95%, something like that, produced from petroleum. And we recognize, first of all, that emissions have got to fall towards net zero by 2050. That means a lot less fossil fuel in the mix, but we also recognize the march of new technologies like electrification and hydrogen technologies. And so we've been looking at strategies for what is needed to fill the gaps in society after that. And we've looked very long and hard at the role of liquid fuels. one of our conclusions is that there is still a role for liquid fuels, but of course they've got to come through a route which makes them fully sustainable and consistent with that net zero objective by 2050. Now, this may sound a bit strange, but it's important to recognize that why do we have liquid fuels today from petroleum? It's because a long time ago, that was a biofuel that was stored. And so it's not a huge surprise that actually using biomass and biogenic routes today, we can produce something that is similar. There are a lot of implications for how we will do that, and that's the subject of other parts of this webinar series. We started on Monday talking about the overall strategy, and Tuesday a session on the various different technologies. But there's a whole set of questions around how this interlinks with the bioeconomy, and of course that's what you're asking here today. In terms of the role of the fuels industry, what we are seeing is that there is great scope and potential for producing significant volumes of low carbon liquid fuels. It's not going to replace the current use of petroleum. That's not our expectation. And it's not the need either, because by the time we've seen substantial electrification and some use of hydrogen, we may need only a third of what we need today in terms of volumes of liquid fuels. But the work that we've done suggests very strongly, and based on very good third-party evidence, that it is in fact possible to do that. It means sourcing a very wide range of biogenic feedstock, including a lot of different types of materials such as interseasonal crops, wastes, residues, co-products, and the existing volumes of sustainable biofuels, and building out capacity to convert those into high quality fuels. We also see a role later for e-fuels coming in, but we certainly think that the bioeconomy will take the lead for many years to start with this transition. The role of the industry that currently is producing fuels then, we think, is to create the technology hubs and lead on the investment for making this all work, but will rely very heavily on the biosector, agriculture and forestry in particular, but potentially other sources of biogenic and captured carbon, to provide the feedstocks and build the value chains, partnering with us and with other companies to take what in many cases will be quite diverse supplies, sometimes what we might call low quality biomass, to produce into the high quality liquid fuels that we have today. So the role of the fuel companies will also be to come up with the right commercial agreements that makes it attractive for the bioeconomy participants to invest in producing the material, aggregating, possibly pre-treating, and to do that in a way that enables us to grow the sector, learn as we do, scale it up, and then learn how to do the next plant in other geographies as well. We cannot be in the fuels industry, we cannot be the experts in that upstream part of it. In a sense, what we're talking about is gradually and completely replacing the upstream part of the business that we are connected with at the moment. Historically, fuels refiners have been connected to upstream oil production, petroleum oil production, and our vision is in future we will be connected strongly to the biomass economy as the upstream for feedstock to turn into high value liquid fuels. So that's how we see it. But clearly we have a lot of questions to answer. And so let me stop there and let's take the conversation further with Marco and Alexander.
Thanks a lot, John. So let's turn to Alexander next. Alexander, you're coming at this from the perspective of farmers. So what opportunities and challenges exist for farmers when it comes to liquid fuels in the bioeconomy?
Yeah, hello everybody. A nice and warm welcome from Vienna. What opportunities we see as crop shaker for the farmers producing biofuels within the bioeconomy? The EU will be not able to do without liquid fuels in 2020, post 2020 to 2030. And indeed, the Commission experts has proposed a change in composition of the EU vehicle fleet that will be gradually 86 to 89% of them will run on an internal combustion engine in 2030. So there is a large, still a large demand on biofuels and on liquid fuels for doing mobility. And in our point of view, certified sustainable crop-based biofuels are a cost-efficient tool and should remain part of the transport fuel mix as long as liquid fuels are needed. Reducing GHG emissions in the transport sector is comparatively more difficult and costly than in any other sector. So crop-based biofuels are a significant market outlet at the moment for European vegetable oils. More or less 2/3 of rapeseed oil produced in Europe are going into biofuel production. For cereals, 11 million tons of cereals are produced from 11 million tons of cereals, bioethanol is produced, and sugar beets are already used for biofuel production. So crop-based biofuels are at the core of EU protein ambition, because in every process, biofuel processed, high protein feed is produced. And this reduced the EU dependency on imports of potential genetically modified soya meals from South America. So protein and animal feeds from the processing of crop-based biofuels account for a significant amount of EU protein-rich byproduct consumption, which is at the moment more or less 14%. So what challenges do we face? One challenge is that the EU biofuels policy is not continuing and stable, and has no stability, because RED II is not yet implemented and we are already talking about RED III. A successful EU decarbonization transport policy should not reverse, but rather build on what has been achieved by the RED II, which would provide investors confidence. All sustainable biofuels should continue to be promoted. The cap on certified crop-based biofuels should be reassessed and revised upwards to provide each member state with flexibility, taking into consideration the current certified sustainable crop-based biofuels market uptake, higher renewable and emissions reduction targets, and the fact that since then the delegated act on high ILUC risk biofuels was adopted, and these biofuels should be phased out to zero in 2030 or by 2030. Advanced biofuels must be established as an additional instrument and not as a replacement for existing crop-based biofuels. This is a very crucial point to further reduce fossil fuel use and greenhouse gas emissions from transport. The corona health crisis hit the demand for transport fuels. This situation increases the volatility on the market, and the European Union's biofuel producers suffer of a lack of visibility. So that's all for my first time. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Alexander. Marco, let's turn to you next. You're working obviously in Finland, but also with the forestry sector. So how do liquid fuels feature in the strategies of the forest industry?
Thanks a lot, Dave, for the question, and many thanks to Fuels Europe for setting up these conferences. I think they are absolutely necessary and welcome. I think it's especially important what Fuels Europe obviously has recognized is that we have dialogue along the value chain. No one single part of the business can solve the challenges that we have or grasp the business opportunities, which is, of course, the most interesting part, and to provide solutions to the challenges of climate change mitigation. So I'm pleased to represent UPM. It's a forest industry company. We've been doing forest industry stuff for 100 or 200 years. We are one of the leading paper, pulp, timber, label stock, etc. producers with about 10 billion turnover. Last year, slightly less, but on our way back to 10 billion. And in 2006, we recognized that some of our businesses will be reducing, namely paper consumption has been reducing dramatically. And we started looking at opportunities in new business areas. Luckily, we actually back then already betted on the right horse and went for what today is called advanced biofuels, feedstock that are promoted also within the EU regulation. We made our investment decision in 2012, started production in 2015, and have been successfully selling advanced biofuels to the market. And with 130,000 tons of production, I presume we are the largest producer of advanced biofuels within the European Union. I think it's really timely to discuss, and I want to touch upon a couple of issues on why biofuels and what's the role of advanced biofuels and the bioeconomy in general in responding both to the issue of transport decarbonization or reducing emissions in transport, but also broader to the climate change mitigation debate. And it's fair enough to say that there's a lot of different points of view when it comes to sustainability and the bioeconomy, but I don't think there will be any chance of providing solutions for what needs to be done with regards to reducing emissions without really focusing on the opportunities of the bioeconomy. And maybe a couple of points to begin with. There's already a really dramatic and fast increase of the production of renewable fuels, and especially HVO, renewable diesel. This is happening also within the European Union, but especially in the US and Asia. We will be going from 10 million tons to 30 million tons already with the current investments. And this is only covering now the part which is relating to renewable diesel production. There's also a lot happening with regards to second generation ethanol. The challenge here will be definitely that there will be scarcity of feedstock. There will probably not be enough feedstock for 40 or 50 million tons, and therefore there is going to be a race for used cooking oil and animal fats, which are commonly used today. And this is why we at UPM, we are considering currently to invest 1 billion euros into a new biorefinery. We have informed that it will be located either in Kotka in Finland or in Rotterdam. And we've looked at every single aspect of the market, the future scenarios for what is the role of these types of fuels, which types of fuels should be produced, etc. And we came to the conclusion that we really need to do something differently. And this is why we're looking as a forest industry company, obviously at one aspect, which is obvious, the solid biomass. So using residues of our forest industry operations, those that have the lowest value and are quite commonly normally burned. We can make high quality renewable fuels and also feedstock for the biochemical industry and fuel for different end uses from aviation to transport and heavy duty. And this is quite important for us because it wouldn't necessarily make sense for us to go to the same resource pools as some of the much bigger companies. So we're looking at where do we find the niche within the bioeconomy sector. And the second example is that we've been cultivating actually already for 5 years, cumulatively over 50,000 hectares, and with plans to increase a winter crop in Uruguay, where we have forest industry operations since 30 years. A crop with high potential, looking at other crops, but the main thing is that we're looking at winter cropping, sequential cropping, carbon farming, what we call climate positive fuels. By using the land in the winter time when it's not in productive use, we can sequester carbon in the soil, we can get additional protein as well, and a very highly sustainable, non-edible feedstock for the refining industry for our potential facility. So to stop here, I think bioeconomy provides a lot of opportunities, and I think it's an interesting signal already that a forest industry company ended up in the, so to say, oil industry. It's not easy. It's a completely different ballgame that we entered, and now we have also entered the agriculture sector, which is completely new to us. So again, I think the future of these different types of businesses will definitely be combining competencies and skills from these different aspects of the industry.
Yeah, that's exactly true, Marco. It strikes me that the three of you are coming from sectors which ordinarily didn't have much to do with each other, right? I mean, it's three very, very different sectors. So it's probably a good opportunity for each of you to talk about what your expectations are for the bioeconomy and what maybe the other sectors should be doing to prepare. So Alexander, let me put that question to you. Maybe you could address this directly to John. How should liquid fuel companies be preparing for the changes coming in the bioeconomy, some of those changes that you outlined in your introductory answer?
Well, difficult question, thanks. In our point of view, all renewable low-carbon fuels should be able to contribute towards the EU climate and renewable objectives under the level playing fields and strict sustainability criteria, such as European standards for agricultural production, waste prevention and management standards, and strong traceability requirements to ensure that only sustainable feedstocks are used. So allow for increased use of sustainable crop-based biofuels, which with little or no risk of indirect land use change on deforestation, provided they meet rigorous sustainability criteria in EU and third countries and enable as wide as possible a base of sustainability feedstocks to be used for biofuel production. To maximize the greenhouse gas emissions reduction and air quality benefits of higher biocomponents in plants, and an effective incorporation of P7 and E10 should be achieved across the European Union, and higher blends such as P10 and E10 or E10 plus should be progressively rolled out. Moreover, higher blends, example given P30, E85, ED95, and P100 should be further incentivized. Acknowledge the use of low-carbon fuels when setting up CO2 standards for vehicle and road charging, basing on the emissions reductions on a well-to-wheel approach is our point of view.
So John, let me get you to respond to that, because we heard there from Alexander a call for higher blends. So what can the industry do to start planning for higher blends? Is there anything preventing the industry to start planning for that right now? What does it actually require technically in the refinery and also in the vehicles? John, you're on mute.
Very good question. And I think there are two areas that we should talk about. One is the technologies for conversion of the biomass. and the other is the fuel grades or the fuel quality, if you like. And Alexander, you've made reference to some of those fuel grades in your question there. So the first point that I would make is that the technologies we're bringing forward now, in many cases, are actually able to incorporate a lot more biomaterial, bio feedstock, inside the existing specifications. And to some degree, that is our strategy. We also see there is a benefit of having, shall we say, the existing bio components included. And I do believe there's a conversation we must have about the future fuel grades. That's connected to another point, though, and that is we really do need to involve the regulators and the vehicle industry in terms of understanding the strategy about how we make best use of the biofuels and biogenic-based fuels that we can make. If we are targeting mostly the existing fleet, then we will have to meet existing fuel standards, the B7 and the E10 standards that we've got. If we are preparing for new vehicles that can be certified with high bio, then that opens the door to have new developments of the specification that are clearly designed to have a much higher bio content and potentially 100% bio content as well. We're in favor of both. We actually think you need both approaches. Biofuels of all kinds have got a great advantage of being, we can make them backwards compatible, which means older vehicles can have a much lower carbon footprint. And we also see that the internal combustion engine, where it is very efficient, very clean, probably hybridized, can actually also have a climate neutral future, and certainly for some sectors. So we've got to think in both ways, how we do backwards compatible fuels and how we evolve fuels in the future. And I do agree, we've got to have that conversation about fuel grades.
Marco, let me put the same question to you that I put to Alexander. How do you think liquid fuels companies should be preparing for the changes that are coming with the bioeconomy?
As I said earlier, I think it's the key to success is collaboration, and I think if I could turn back the time, I think I would have appreciated having seen, to see some type of a closer collaboration along the value chain, starting with the automotive industry, the fuels industry, and everybody else in the value chain, maybe slightly earlier than recently. I think that is definitely one really important issue. I think there are, looking forward, I think there are two different types of business models. I think we will see the refineries expanding their biofuel portfolio. I think we will see the refineries and the liquid fuel companies expanding into new feedstock. And we will see collaborations between the traditional forest industry or the bioeconomy sector with the refineries. And then we also do have niche players. I mean, I consider us very much a niche player with 130,000 tons today production. Okay, considering adding up 500,000 tons. We're also currently investing and building already a new wood-based biochemical biorefinery in Leuna, Germany. So we're looking at building within the next years potentially a business which is well over $1 billion turnover. So these developments actually can go quite fast. I would say that one of the most important, and I'm sure we will come back to it later as well, but probably the most important issue is that we focus on ensuring sustainability. I don't think that the industry, whether it's whichever part of the industry, can really survive another crisis. If you look back 10, 15 years, we've had a number of issues. We've had issues with food versus fuel. We've had issues relating to certain feedstocks such as palm oil. We've had the ILUC debate. I mean, we've actually had a debate, some type of a debate relating to sustainability over and over again. And I think it's really, really important that we ensure as industry that what we're doing is sustainable and acceptable to the broader audience. Yes, to regulators, but definitely to the NGO community and others, while recognizing that, of course, we will not be able to please everybody. But I think sustainability of the feedstock and our operations is really key, and it's the license to operate in this business.
Well, just a reminder to you at home, you can put your questions there on the screen and I'll read them out to the panelists in a little bit. And of course, you can join in on the conversation with the hashtag #RefuelsWeek. I'm on the wrong side, there it is, on Twitter. I want to talk a little bit about trade and security of supply, because this is another big issue when we're talking about the bioeconomy. Alexander, what impact do you think liquid fuels in the bioeconomy will have on the issues of trade and security of supply?
Well, interesting question. The production of bioenergy supports the transition to a bioeconomy as well as to the circular economy. The development and distribution of biofuels can be a step towards achieving an economy which is less dependent on fossil fuels. The production of mass biofuels is a precondition for greater investment in the bioeconomy and the deployment of solutions in the agricultural, food and forestry sectors to mitigate climate challenges. These biorefineries do not just provide energy, they also provide the basis for biosourced products such as bioplastics, bio-based chemical products, and so on. The transition to a green and prosperous Europe, which is less dependent on fossil fuels, should be based on the renewable carbon stock of agricultural and forest biomass. So it is principally rural areas which are confronted with sluggish economic growth, low incomes, and population decline. Continuing to invest in biofuels and the production of advanced biofuels will make it possible to support rural areas in Europe to create optimism and boost innovation, reversing rural exodus, poverty, and social decline. The increase in production of biomass per hectare must be promoted because it makes it possible to respond to concerns about food security, the development of the bioeconomy, and carbon storage in soils and other to tackle climate change. Stimulate investments in new biofuel production plants by providing stable policies over the lifetime for the plants. Also, beyond RED II would help the EU to increase its energy self-sufficiency and diversify its supply sourcing. Regarding sustainable finance and taxonomy, the criteria must be aligned on RED II, and food and feed crops used for manufacturing biofuels must be eligible for the activities that mitigate climate change. Thanks.
Marco, let me ask you a kind of a related question here, which is related to biomass imports from other regions. Are there potential limitations for biomass availability in the EU? Could imports help mollify any issue that exists there? And then what would be the knock-on effects for trade and security of supply?
Well, I think there's plentiful of opportunities within the European Union, and you know, I'm also representing here the Advanced Biofuels Coalition, where we have members looking at lignocellulosic ethanol production. There's already projects being built and soon up and running. There's already existing facilities, and there's definitely opportunity for example, straw-based ethanol as part of the agricultural community. I think in many cases, looking at these potential investments in providing or producing liquid fuels from these biogenic sources, you're looking at a sourcing area which is quite close to the biorefinery. That's also the limiting factor on your size, because actually one of the expensive parts of your production assets is the transport of your goods. So that's why we, for example, have designed the potential new facility for the part that would be using solid biomass, such as sawdust or bark or harvesting residues. There's a certain size limitation which links to what we expect to be able to source from the area and what is financially feasible to transport. There certainly are certain feedstock that it makes sense to cultivate somewhere else. There might be better conditions, and I think this Uruguay case, our climate positive fuels, is a good example of utilizing the idle land in wintertime in a country far away, and still it's economically very much feasible to transport the oil or the seeds to Europe for crushing or then production. We've been doing this for 5 years already, and it's working really well. But I think also there's a lot of talk within the agricultural sector today on carbon farming, on these more sustainable cropping methods, on winter cropping, sequential cropping, and I think these will definitely not create huge opportunities in Finland. Our winters are maybe not so suitable for that, but in many parts of Europe. And we are collaborating, for example, in one research project, which is funded by the Commission on low-risk biofuels, with I think 10, 11 partners, a couple of companies from Italy like ENI and the Biogas Association of Italy, but with 6, 7, 8 research institutes where we are actually doing exactly that. We're experimenting and studying how we can expand the opportunities of advanced biofuels with feedstock, which is actually produced with these new methods, sequential cropping, cover crops, etc. So I think there's, again, while especially with regard to regulation, there's been a certain distancing from in the biofuels, first generation biofuels from the agricultural sector. I think we actually might see a rebirth of that relationship with the new opportunities that will be available. And I think it will be interesting to see how this type of cover crops and others will be appreciated by the Commission when they will be making their proposals on the amendments to the directives.
John, what's your take on this idea of importing biomass? And then also maybe you could speak more generally about the issues of trade and security of supply.
So I should outline that the work that we've done has worked almost entirely on the basis of biomass coming from the EU. That's clearly a policy preference of policymakers that we become more independent in energy supply and resilient, and there's also a wish to create the jobs. At the moment, our feedstock for the fuels that we make comes from petroleum, most of which is imported, and the bill for that approaches something like €1 billion a day. Now that's for 13 million barrels a day. We do not foresee making anywhere near that volume of low carbon liquid fuels in the future. But it could be, as I've said earlier, 25, 30% of that. And that all requires feedstock every day. And as purchasing, or companies like us and others purchasing that feedstock or purchasing intermediate materials from these feedstocks will clearly create income in rural areas, will create jobs in those areas, and also maintains the energy resilience of some aspects of the energy system. Because when we make these fuels, they're very storable, just as petroleum, diesel, and gasoline type fuels are storable today, and jet fuels. And that means you've got that resilience in terms of security of supply. Now, for sure, there is potential for import of feedstocks, but there is another angle that I wanted to talk about, and that is, it's been surprising for us that we've been able to see the potential volumes for these fuels from Europe, because if you simply look at a globe, Europe is a relatively populated continent, and it is not a huge land area, but there are many other parts of the world that have very large land areas. And also we note that there are many of these areas that are not heavily electrified and will not be heavily electrified for many years to come. And so the point we make is that developing these technologies, these business models, these agriculture models and value chains could well become models that can be adopted in other parts of the world for them to move to a lower carbon society and potentially climate neutral society as well. And in our view, that is very consistent with Europe's aim to be a leader in climate action. It's not only about Europe reducing its emissions, it's about Europe establishing the ways that other parts of the world can do the same. And so the potential is very significant in Europe, but it may be even higher outside of Europe, where the land masses are greater, the bioproductivity in some parts of the world the potential is enormous in many parts of the world. So we think that that should be also part of Europe's strategy to help create these models.
Well, this question of sourcing, of course, goes to the issue of competition, whether the increase of the bioeconomy is going to result in an increase in competition for feedstock and raw materials. Let me ask you, Alexander, do you worry about a situation where you're getting a race, a competition to try to get these feedstocks?
No, absolutely not. Because according to the latest Renewable Energy Progress Report from the Commission, in recent years, no correlation has been observed between food prices and biofuel demand. And any impact on food prices is small compared to other dynamics in the global food market. So most member states did not observe any impacts on prices due to the increased bioenergy demand within their countries. And additionally, DDGS and rapeseed and sunflower meals resulting from the processing of European arable crops into biofuels are GM-free. And in the EU, the market of GM-free proteins is tight and should continue to be tight as the EU Farm to Fork strategy promotes an aspirational target of 25% agricultural land area under organic. So in our point of view, there is no competition from feedstock and raw materials for biofuels and producing food and feed. In our point of view, this is a very well combination of both.
John, do you worry about a risk of competition for these raw materials?
Well, yes, and we hear the discussion certainly in the Brussels centered dialogue of the competition actually between potentially the power sector and the fuel sector for biomass. And one of the things that we note in the European Commission's own work that they published in 2018 called A Clean Planet for All, they modeled a number of different scenarios for how to get to climate neutrality. And the key one that they have used for designing the Green Deal is a scenario known as the 1.5 tech scenario, meaning consistency with the Paris goal, 1.5 degree stabilization, and achieved through heavy deployment of technology. what we see there is actually around 2040, quite a significant increase in the use of biomass, but it almost all goes into the power sector. So we note that there is some understanding that the biomass can be available, but we do question whether having almost exclusive diversion of that to the power sector is the right thing. We know that under some circumstances, energy molecules may be more valuable than electrons. And so it would be strange to convert all your biomass into electricity and then have to consider ways to store the electricity when you actually had a more storable resource in the first place. We can see for sure in some applications, biomass to power will make sense, but there's a couple of other points as well. One is actually some of the biofuels plants also produce some power and waste heat for example, residential heating in nearby areas. And so it's not necessarily either or. And also we see that a key role for biofuels in some sectors or subsectors of transport will actually relieve the pressure on not only renewable power generation, but also the infrastructure needed, fast charging and distribution for example, heavy duty vehicles. That will be a significant cost in itself. So we think that there'll be a mix of solutions in the future. There'll be a mix of uses for biomass. And there's no need, or certainly it's not appropriate to have an exclusive diversion of biomass to the power sector when these things can be complementary.
Marco, do you worry about competition for biomass?
I certainly don't. And I actually, what John just said about the Commission 2040 scenario on a lot of biomass going for heat and power or energy generation, I actually would believe that some of the quite recent developments on hydrogen, on adding a lot of new solar power, wind power, I think actually the competition will be much more on between chemical industry and the biofuels, and whether it's competition. I know too well definitions like competing use, cascade, or hierarchy, and I think it's a really tricky issue. You always have an alternative use for most products, and I think the more we actually focus on that, and while I just previously said that sustainability is the key, defining from Brussels to strict hierarchies on what goes where and what's not allowed in member states, while the ecosystems are really quite different from Brussels to Helsinki or Paris to Rome. And I think we do need to stick and understand the local circumstances quite well. And that is actually especially true with regard to bioeconomy, where the role of bioeconomy is very different. So, Dave, to your question, there is, of course, always a certain competition. I don't think it's necessarily a question of availability. I think there's a lot of opportunities looking at abandoned land, degraded land when it comes to the agriculture sector. When it comes to forest industry, the focus will be when we're looking at biofuels, advanced biofuels, and the forest biomass usage for making these fuels. I think everybody will focus on residues. So you will always look at the waste side streams, the residual streams of the forestry operations. It will be difficult to justify to your stakeholders what NGOs would call cutting down whole trees for the use in the liquid fuels industry. While I don't necessarily like that term that I just used, but this is the way a lot of people would be proposing that debate in Brussels.
Well, there seems to be consensus on this panel, at least, that some of those concerns here in Brussels about competition are overblown. Let's go to the audience for some questions. We've had a bunch of questions come in already, which is great. Thanks for those. Keep sending them in. So this first question comes from Denny Kobianchi. This is a question for John. A backbone of the bioeconomy development is the availability of biorefineries in Europe. How is the situation in this sense, and what is the potential for conversion of existing traditional refineries? Is it an issue of funding or of regulation?
So thank you, Denny. Good question. There's a lot of evolution around this subject. In the last few years, 3-4 years, we've seen 3 quite large refineries converted to a biorefinery role. We believe there'll be a 4th one in the near future. But there is also, alongside that, a gradual introduction of biomaterial, biofeedstock in a co-processing role into many more refineries around Europe. And so the total volume going through refineries is increasing continually. What typically happens with these refineries, certainly when the refinery is being converted completely to bioprocessing, is that typically only 1 or 2 of the units of the refinery will be retained, and their role will be reconfigured from a chemical engineering standpoint to treat a different quality of material going in. Usually what that means is that the total throughput of the refinery is significantly lower than it was when it was a petroleum refiner. But then you also have the aspect that, if you like, the value added, because you are upgrading from, in some cases, a lower quality biomaterial to a suite of very high quality fuels. The value adding is higher, if you like. But you're right, this is intrinsically linked to a refinery conversions and biorefinery construction and development as well. So that is a subject that goes hand in hand with that. We covered that in some detail on Tuesday in terms of the technologies and the emerging role of the refinery in Europe. But we expect more and more of those to be converting and to introducing much larger quantities of bio in the near future.
Okay, the next question, I think this can be for Alexander, but if anyone else wants to answer, let me know. It's from an anonymous questioner. How do you position the increased demand on certified crop-based biofuels if these would be reflected in RED 3 versus increased demand on crops for food? Alexander, do you want to take that one?
Yes, I can do so. Thanks for the question. Well, as I've tried to say, in our point of view, biofuel production will stipulate the market, and biofuel production is always co-processing and producing protein meal. So when we use cereals for producing biofuels, these are mostly not usable for human nutrition, and by processing of biofuels we can put them back into the feed and food circle by producing protein meal. And so in our point of view, this is a good combination for doing both, producing bioenergy and producing food and feed in Europe, and stipulate the market as well in this point.
Marco or John, would you also like to come in on this? Nope, that's okay. Let's move on to the, John, you started talking. You're on mute, but I think you're saying no.
Sorry, yeah, I was on mute. Look, I think the agriculture industry should be left to develop their technologies, their methods. One of the things that I've learned over the years that I've been working in the subject is that actually, of all of the agriculture in the world, possibly the very highest standards of all are applied to biofuels production in the EU. And I think that's perspective that's not always seen by other people. And despite the fact that we hear a lot of criticism of the standards in the EU, there's actually a lot of people around the world that look up to those standards and see those as a substantial sustainability standard. It's not, in our view, it's not for us to judge as a fuels industry. That needs to be a dialogue between agriculture and the regulators as to how you define that. But what we do see is great ingenuity in that sector to have an integrated strategy for different crops, crop rotation, cover crops, etc. And well, while these feedstocks are deemed sustainable, we think that they have a key place in the strategy.
Okay, John, I have another question for you. This comes from Alexander Wayne. Do you see it happen that biofuels can be accounted for in vecto? Right now, heavy-duty truck emissions are TTW, so bio has no impact on emissions.
So, as I understand it, this is really about sort of road pricing, in particular for the heavy-duty sector. And it's clear that there's a number of different ways of encouraging low-carbon mobility. And I guess I would give a slightly broader answer here. We think that there are some real inconsistencies in how European policy works. And those inconsistencies reflect what at the moment is very strong support for electrification, and we think uneven and really unequal support for the way renewable fuels are recognized. I think this question here refers to the fact that the CO2 intensity of shall we say, an electric vehicle, electric truck or hydrogen-based truck will qualify it to have very little in the way of road charging or lower rates, whereas an internal combustion engine vehicle running high percentage or 100% renewable fuel is not likely to get the same treatment or would end up paying the same as petroleum. That's very similar to what we see in the car standards. And we think that, the general answer here is we think we are a long way from getting real technology neutrality in the way renewables are treated in transport. And at the heart of that is the way manufacturers of vehicles are measured for the CO2 of their vehicles. And the fact that that manufacturing number for the truck or the car is then used downstream, if you like, at customer level for triggering or blocking a number of different other treatments. So in cars, typically cars pay very little or in some countries no annual car tax. As a business car, the taxation rate is lower if it's an electric car. But if you have 100% renewables, which we think is entirely possible in the near future, you'd pay the same taxation as if you were running 100% petroleum. We think that's very uneven and does not encourage investment in the industry. And to quote something from the industrial policy of Europe as it's recently been revised, and in particular with the input that's been given for all of the energy intensive industries, there's a recognition that you need, it's called push measures as well as pull measures. And what that means is a push measure is a requirement for manufacturers to increase the supply of something, and pull measures to encourage customers to make the choice and buy those products. What we're seeing at the moment is renewable fuels policy in Europe is all about a push measure through the red to require fuel suppliers to increase the renewable content. But there is nothing in the way of a pull measure to encourage customers to step forward and say, I want to have more, or I want to have 100% renewable fuels powering my vehicle or my fleet. They get no tax reduction. If it's a truck, they have no change in their road pricing. And there's no other subsidiary benefits like, for example, parking in cities or anything like that. We think that's an important anomaly to address. And we have made proposals as FuelsEurope and also together with quite a wide range of industries for how that adjustment can be made by the European Commission and national authorities.
Just to check, Alexander and Marco, did you also have any thoughts about whether biofuels could be accounted for in the vehicle energy consumption energy tool?
Yes, I think I fully agree with John, and I think it's an extremely important issue. I think we have two issues on the agenda at the moment. We have all these biofuels related regulation, but I think the really decisive issue will be this technology neutrality and setting the CO2 limits for cars and vans and heavy duty later on. I think now is the moment to actually recognize the role that liquid fuels can play, and that to bring in that technology neutrality, unless the Commission is willing to do it now, I think it will be very hard, possibly, to do that later. And I think it will shape many decisions that will be taken in the coming years by industry as well. So I think it is really important. Actually, it's probably more important discussion also from an industry point of view than the Renewable Energy Directive or something else, which is of course important, and will be setting a lot of important. It will create a lot of opportunities for the biofuel industry, especially in the advanced sector, to invest. But I think this is a hugely important matter.
John, you wanted to respond to that?
Yeah, if I could come back for another piece of this, actually. I just wanted to say that we recognize that the European Commission and several other stakeholders see a very significant role long-term for aviation and maritime to use bio-based fuels, low-carbon renewable liquid fuels. We agree. But to us, that does not translate into making the decision right now to only focus on those sectors. One of the things that we observe is that the development of new renewable technologies is typically capital intensive in the early days. And certainly when it comes to the advanced biofuels parts of this agenda, these plants are quite high in capital intensity. And so you need a price signal that can be passed on in the market to enable these plants to be financed at scale. In the aviation and maritime world, these are fuels markets that are internationally competitive. Ships and planes have choices as to whether they refuel in Europe or outside of Europe. There's a real potential for what is actually called, in policy terms, carbon leakage. So if we start with strong policy measures requiring high blends of bio in aviation or maritime, we have a real risk of actually having less fuel delivered in Europe and the fuel supply going to countries that don't have those standards. And it will fail as a policy. As investors and potential investors in this area, we need to have a customer base and a policy tool set that can make the fuels affordable for customers for a period of time so that we can build out those investments. We see road transport as a critical stepping stone to longer term supply of aviation and maritime. Actually, as suppliers, whether it goes in a truck or a car in a plane shouldn't really matter to us. But what does matter is a security of contract and ability to take the volumes that we can produce, enough for us to pay off the early investments. Making the early investments will help us bring the costs down. It'll help the biosector to build out the supply chains, the aggregation of biomass, the pre-treatment of biomass, etc., so that later there are bigger volumes available. So we call it a no-regret strategy, to start with road transport and then extend the volumes much greater volumes later to aviation and maritime. But I wanted to clear that. Thank you.
Alexander, you raised your hand to respond?
Yes, thanks. I absolutely agree to this. And maybe I can add an additional thing in this discussion. When it comes to advanced biofuels, at the moment we have a lot of techniques producing petrol or petrol replacement fuels, and very little techniques producing diesel and gasoline fuels. And we have to change this in the future, because in our point of view, we will at least need gasoline for heavy duty transport, maritime and shipping, but also for running our agricultural and forestry machinery is for diesel, and therefore we will need diesel gasoline production, especially on advanced base, because electrification is not coming to the ground in agriculture and forestry and within the next 20 years, I guess. Thanks.
Marco, you also raised your hand to respond.
Yeah, thanks. Let me just echo actually also what John said, and I think I give you a practical example on aviation, and it is sometimes a bit, may I say, even irritating when some stakeholders are saying that the biofuels should only go to aviation. Well, trust me that anyone considering to build a new biorefinery with the price tag of 1 billion euros will maximize the output of sustainable aviation fuels. But let's also remember that it's by far the most complex fuel to produce, and it will always remain, well, not always, but in most cases, in many cases, it will remain a small share of your total output. So you can't actually just put it all there. I guess in our case, it's or in a normal case, it's 20-25% you may be able to produce sustainable aviation fuels. So you have 75% that you need the market. And it's actually important to recognize that for these investments to materialize, you obviously are looking at your total business case and the transport mandates, or maybe some kind of a system for between a biorefinery and the vehicle manufacturer, or however it will work, as been designed and proposed by some stakeholders. I think these are really important drivers. So you will not go for 100%, or you can, but it will be much more rare to go for 100% aviation, and therefore you need all of these sectors contributing to your business case. And I think that is something which is maybe not always recognized by stakeholders, even in Brussels.
Well, we've had two very political questions come in, so I'm going to group them together and get each of you to respond, and I think we can kind of close out. So a question comes from Olivier Mace. The NGO backlash against biofuels has made regulators nervous, and as a result, the full potential remains partly underexploited. Can we ever get out of this situation without a broad societal consensus regarding sustainable agriculture, or what sustainable agriculture is? How do we make it happen? And then a similar question from an anonymous questioner. Green and green thinking political parties do not necessarily support biofuels, rather the opposite. What do you anticipate regarding the EU's view and its upcoming decisions about the future of biofuels? Alexander, let's get your thoughts on this first.
Well, very difficult, and especially difficult to answer in a few words. As it was mentioned earlier, Europe has the highest standards on agricultural production, and especially on feedstock production for biofuels. And we think that this is a very good practice and very well model to roll out on other areas of the world, because in Austria and also in Europe we are producing very high volumes of agricultural goods and on a very sustainable way. And in some parts of the world there is no this is not the case at the moment, and we think we should put our regulations on a bilateral way to other regions to stimulate their production and to increase sustainability for agricultural production as a whole in the whole world. But in our point of view in Europe, we have at the moment the highest standards and the strictest regulation for producing feedstocks for biofuels. And for our point of view, there is no need to increase these levels again.
Marco, what do you think about this fundamental political question, particularly coming from the perspective of the forestry sector?
Yes, societal consensus on sustainable agriculture or sustainable forestry. That's a tricky one. When it comes to agriculture, I think we will see a lot of changes. I think, you know, the negotiations on common agricultural policy have taken quite a while and they haven't been finalized yet. I think there's a lot of attention put on the role of agricultural sector in mitigating climate change. There's a lot of talk about carbon farming and cover crops and others that I mentioned earlier. And I think this actually might revitalize the relationship within the biofuel industry and the agricultural sector. And I think a number of opportunities will materialize there. I think also we need to recognize that in these days, I think societal consensus is pretty hard to achieve, as there's a lot of divergent views also on forestry. I can be quite, you know, there's complex issues related to forest sinks, carbon sinks, harvesting levels. There's the LULUCF regulation, which will be debated and proposed for revision as well. So there's complex issues. And I think from an industry point of view, again, we need to focus on communication, sustainability, providing information on how we can ensure that our supply chains are sustainable and green.
So, John, let me put this same political question to you, and I'll add on a third question which we've just had come in, which is very much related. It's from Stephen Ramakers, who says, except for the speaker from the European Parliament on Monday, most European decision makers are not seeing biofuels or e-fuels as low carbon because CO2 is released during the combustion and use. How can we convince them that the CO2 released from the fuel use is replacing total CO2 release, or for which CO2 is just used as a temporary energy carrier if CO2 is captured? Politics like simple things, and electricity is easy to understand and sell to people. So how do we tackle this, John?
Just in terms of the politics to start with, I mean, I think we see a lot of replaying of this conversation around what is the silver bullet that replaces petroleum. And I've had too many years in this subject, maybe. I've heard that story over and over again. And the first observation I make is that in the early forms of this conversation, we were talking about how to replace 13 million barrels a day of petroleum use in Europe and 90 million barrels a day globally. And I think it's fair to say that is a challenge for any of the biofuel technologies because it's a huge amount of energy every day. But we're not talking about that as the objective in Europe. Please, I ask people to refer to the work that's available on our website, on the Fuels Europe website under Clean Fuels for All. We're showing a target which is much lower than that, more like 25 to 30% of that volume. And the key to it is we are not relying on one feedstock alone. We literally go after every available feedstock that can contribute to that. And so it's a combination of the sustainable first generation biofuels we have today, and then substantial growth in every form of waste and residue and co-product type feedstock, together with some other contributions from industrial wastes, captured CO2, and e-fuels, for example, in the later stages. And it gets you to that target of 25 to 30% of where we are today. And we think the diversity of that supply chain is one of the strengths of it, because it also allows diversity across Europe, depending on what feedstock is available in what location, and diversity of technologies and many different technology providers. And so we do think we've moved the conversation on together with the stakeholders, including Alexander and Marco here. We've moved the conversation on and shown that you can do it. And by the way, the volumes of feedstock that we have used have come from third-party studies, including most notably work of the JRC, for what feedstocks are available for biofuels. And we continue to look at that, and we continue to confirm that these are available in a sustainable fashion. And so we maintain it is still very much within reach, technologically and commercially, if we get the policies right. And we think the policies are entirely reasonable and within reach as well. So you then ask the question about how do you recognize that the carbon is biogenic? I mean, I have to say I'm a little bit amazed that this subject continues to come up. And I agree with the person asking the question that it's a puzzle and a challenge to explain. I mean, I think it's just worth understanding that the basic chemistry of using hydrogen and carbon chemistry for energy is actually what we all as mammals, humans, rely on. We all eat carbohydrates, very similar to hydrocarbons, and we create energy and a bit of heat. And that's the basis of the bioeconomy before we came to industrialization. And we've simply got in the car standards a rather odd test which measures only the physical emission of CO2 from a tailpipe and then describes that as part of the problem on the assumption that it's entirely fossil. I'm not sure whether you've seen, there's a very good TED talk on YouTube that's available from a speaker from Southwest Research Institute. And he explains that that test that is used for vehicles would, for example, give you a completely misrepresentation of another form of transport that is actually climate neutral. If you use a horse fed with biomass and you measure that on the European vehicle test, I'm reliably informed that you get a number that's very similar to the emissions of a Chevrolet Corvette. It's slightly absurd, but that is actually what you're seeing as that test give a misleading result. Another example is, of course, the European ETS, putting biomass into power stations. You get a 0 under ETS, under the emissions under ETS. And yet you put that biomass into a biofuels plant, make a biofuel, put it into a car, and then you get it treated as if it's 100% fossil. It's an anomaly, and I guess my view is that it seems to could be a political choice to retain that anomaly, but it certainly deserves scrutiny. And I think we're not alone in believing that it's unhelpful in possibly preventing a lot of renewables investment if we were to stick with that approach.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's discussion. I want to thank our panelists for some great insights, and also to you at home for following along with us this afternoon and asking some great questions. Before we close out, let me just tell you about the Refuels webinars that are happening next week. So on Monday at 10 o'clock is our next webinar, where we'll be talking about job creation and how to create win-win situations for climate and jobs. Then on Wednesday at 10 o'clock, will be the webinar on feedstock availability and sustainability review. And finally, on Friday, 10 o'clock, there will be the webinar on ensuring social inclusiveness. Those are the 3 for next week. We hope you can join us then for those. And if you missed any of the webinars that have taken place this week, don't worry. You can find them on Fuels Europe's YouTube channel. They will all be there. The whole series will be there. You can eventually find them. So thanks for spending your late afternoon with us, and I wish you all a great evening.